What's up guys, Lifting here. I've been gone for a while and there might be some of you who have been wondering why the hell is Lifting not posting any videos here now that it is a new league in Path of Exile. And trust me guys, I really would like to, but something happened like 10 days ago and that sounded very grave, and it is. My computer died. And I'm gonna tell you in this video what I've been going through to try to get it up and running again and working, and I would love to get your input to try and help me figure out what the cause of this was. I think I may have figured it out, or at least I found something that was a little suspicious that I'm gonna tell you about later on in the video. But if you guys have any opinions, anything you'd like to add to this, please let me know in the comments below what could have gone wrong here. Either way, the TLDR for anyone who's not interested in hearing that story is that I apologize for being away, and you will start seeing videos again on the channel now as soon as I've catched up with everything that I need to do. I still have to get my character into late game and all that stuff I haven't even played. So either way, I've pretty much spent every single hour trying to fix my computer for the last 2 weeks now, and that means waking up after having slept 2 to 3 hours, sitting in front of my computer until 5 or 6 in the morning and just trying to diagnose and figuring out what the issue of this was, because I wasn't really sure if it was a software or an hardware issue. And what would happen was that, weirdly enough, the first symptom I saw of it really was that anytime Discord would be running on my PC, my computer would slow down to a point of pretty much crashing, practically crashing. It would be so slow that I couldn't use it, and I would have to do a hard reset. Eventually it started to happen in both World of Warcraft and in Path of Exile too, where to begin with, it would just be these stutters where it would slow down and wouldn't run very well. It shouldn't be compared to the performance issues that a lot of people are suffering from in Path of Exile right now, because it's to a much larger degree where eventually I had to reset the computer for it to work. The first thing I did was, of course, to try and reinstall Discord. That didn't solve it. Then I updated my GPU drivers. That didn't solve it either. The stutter and eventual crash became more and more frequent in both World of Warcraft and in Path of Exile. So I started to look up in Event Manager, and I had not really anything too important to look at. There was a couple of errors, but nothing that was related to this here. So it didn't really, I wasn't even being given any information as to why this was happening, which was very puzzling. Of course, there was the kernel 43 errors for when I actually had to hard reset the computer. But besides that, there wasn't really anything to give any indication of what the issue was. But 2 weeks earlier, I had been replacing my RAM. I'd been upgrading from 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes. And so I thought maybe it could be the RAM that's faulty, right? It could make sense for that. It could be the computer not being able to read a specific sector and then it crashing. But I didn't really feel like a RAM issue though. So I decided to run what's called a memtest. Memtest 86, I think it's called. It's a program that will test your computer for RAM and diagnose them. And I set it to run overnight. And when I came back in the morning, I could see there was one error in test 7 and test 13, but your RAM are not supposed to have any errors. So the good thing about that was, of course, that I thought to myself, hey, maybe we found the issue here. It's simply a matter of fixing the RAM. But because I was a bit under time pressure, I simply took all of the new RAMs out and plugged in my old ones that I knew worked. After doing that, I booted up again. I did the usual stuff. But as soon as I launched Discord, everything went to shit. The same thing happened if I went into games. It wouldn't work, it would crash. So I then decided to run some stress tests on my system to see if it was overheating or if any other errors would show up. And here's where it gets a little interesting. But before we go into that, I should of course mention that previous to this, I had of course also tried every single software and GPU configuration just to check if I could pinpoint the issue, but without success, unfortunately. So I decided to run some stress tests on my CPU first. After all, I'm still using an old i7-4790K, which to be fair is still performing very, very well. And it's been completely stable ever since I got it like 5 years ago, despite it being overclocked from 4 GHz to 4.8 per core, of course. But to do the stress test, I then used a program called Prime 95. And I ran a test that's referred to as a torture test. And after a long period of biting my nails, looking at my CPU temperatures reaching around 90 Celsius degrees at max load when it really pushes it, it eventually completed, and there were no faults, there were no issues, and not anything to be detected, and the temperature was still within range of what's allowed. But my CPU very rarely hits 90 Celsius degrees in any practical situation. This program is designed to show the very, very upper limits in worst case scenarios. So don't worry, I'm not running with 90 Celsius degrees. Normally they are around 30 and 45 degrees when they're not really under load, and anywhere between 50 and 70 when I'm playing a game or something like that, despite it being overclocked, right? And I will attribute that to my beautiful and amazing Noctua DH14 cooler, which is probably one of the best purchases I've ever made for my computer. It's extremely efficient in cooling your CPU, but the best part is that it's able to do so while remaining relatively quiet, or much more quiet actually than your typical cooler. And that's because the fans are pretty big, and when the fans are big, they have to work less to get the same amount of cooling going. So I can absolutely recommend the Noctua DH14, but I think there are newer versions now in case you're interested. I'll leave a link below. So since the CPU didn't seem to be the problem, I decided to run some stress tests on my GPU. And that is a 1080 Ti EVGA card, which is rather new, 6 months old by the time of this video. And this is where I started to run into trouble. And as many of you tech-savvy guys out there probably know, there are multiple tools out there to monitor your GPU temperature and performance. I downloaded Precision XOC, which is the native monitoring and overclocking software by EVGA, and another program called Combustor, which is the software that allows me to run stress tests. Immediately after launching the software, the EVGA Precision XOC, my computer would crash. Not a blue screen of death or anything like that, but again this thing where it would just completely slow down and become unresponsive, and I would have to do a hard reboot. And as usual, nothing showed up in Event Manager, except for, now the piling up kernel 43 critical errors that would show after I did these reboots. I tried this multiple times, of course, but it always led to the same result of the system crashing. Since my system wasn't able to give me any proper information as to what was going on, I felt like I was starting to run out of ideas. Again, I'd done pretty much every single tweak and software adjustment just to try and see if I could figure out what it was. Nothing worked. So far, this could indicate a faulty PSU, a power supply unit, a faulty motherboard, or the GPU failing. It wasn't the RAM, we know that now. But these three things, that's a pretty broad area, right? There's tons of different things that could go wrong with this. So before I was going to try out new hardware, I decided to do a complete display driver uninstall in safe mode and install an older driver, as I had read that some people were having issues with the 430 drivers, the latest NVIDIA drivers. So I installed the 416 NVIDIA drivers, which came around like 6 months ago from now or something like that. And I know I was using those and I didn't have any trouble with them back then. And this is where things get even more confusing. Because after I'd installed the drivers, I decided to launch Discord just to check. I wasn't expecting it to work right, but lo and behold, there it was. The software would launch and the system seemed stable. I then tried starting Precision and it worked. I did the same thing for Combustor and it all seemed to work just fine. So I was thinking to myself that I'd finally solved the issue. It was as simple as just a hard or complete display driver uninstalled together with an older driver. But just in case it wasn't completely solved, I decided to stress test my GPU to check for potential errors, and everything then seemed fine through that. Temperatures were within range and the benchmarks were consistent with what you could expect from a system such as mine. So I head back into Path of Exile and play around for a while when suddenly it starts to become real choppy for like 10 to 20 seconds. Not the hard crash type of stuttering, but just really, really choppy. And this of course then worries my overly cautious state of mind at the time, thinking that maybe this issue was still here. But since it returned to normal after that, and knowing that people have had performance issues in Blight League, I didn't think too much of it. And at this point in time, it's also 5:30 in the morning, and I really need to get some sleep. So the following day, I need to do a few recordings of my Cobra Lash Assassin build. And here I once again notice these heavy weird frame drops for 20 to 30 seconds. And while they do normalize, they keep returning at a greater frequency again and again. And of course, this is also a huge issue for when you want to do recordings, because I can't have that. I can't work with that. So I opened Combustor, the stress test program, once more to try and run a GPU benchmark after this stuttering has appeared in-game. And as I do so, the program refused to go above 8 frame rates per second. So obviously that gave me a pretty bad benchmark. So fuck, there's still something wrong here. So after spending hours upon hours reading and trying to figure this out, again, I was still not sure if it was software or hardware related. I eventually just decide on reinstalling Windows, because who knows? Speaking from experience or past experience, this has solved many issues. So I try that. This of course takes a bit of time, and once it's completed, I install the newest 436 NVIDIA drivers and head into Path of Exile to check if it's running as it should. Fortunately it does. It actually seems to be okay. So apparently it was just a Windows issue that for some reason I was unable to locate. This is not the end of it though, but it is the end of that day, and once again it's 5 in the morning and I'm going to bed, getting 2 to 3 hours of sleep before I wake up again. And that day it's a Friday and I'm supposed to stream. So I boot up Path of Exile to clean my inventory, and when all of a sudden I experience these heavy frame drops again. For fuck's sake. I also reinstalled Discord just to check if the issue would happen, and it does. It crashes my system, and the same thing happens with the Precision software and Combustor. So I once again do a full display driver, uninstall and revert to the 416 driver that like previously seemed to be stable for a while, and then the issues would start happening all over. So to try something else, I installed MSI's Afterburner monitoring software instead of the EVGA Precision software. And through this, I try to keep a close eye on the various graphs, including voltage, usage, temperature, and so forth. And one thing I notice is that whenever my system becomes unresponsive and crash, the GPU every single time hits the power limit. It's just as it hits that, and then something happens where my system becomes completely unresponsive. So something is going on, and it seems to be power related. And this can also explain the issue I seem to be experiencing, as most Pascal GPUs such as mine are designed to throttle their output when reaching the power limit. So is my system just being completely down throttled when this happens and not recovering. I can't figure out why it's happening, because it shouldn't, like, it's pretty normal for a GPU to hit power limits and such, but it shouldn't down throttle it that hard, and it should recover from it much faster. So something is either preventing my GPU from receiving enough power, or my GPU is simply unable to work with the power it receives. At least that's what I'm thinking at that point in time. And another interesting part is that Event Manager at this point in time now starts to display an NVLDDM-KM error, which is directly associated with the NVIDIA drivers. So there's definitely something going on with my GPU, but obviously I don't know what it is. It could simply be a power issue. Now that I have that information available, I spent what amounts to the next 2 days into the early morning reading up on these issues, trying to figure out how they correlate and why they appear in an attempt to be able to fix it. And while there are some good information out there, I can't find anything specifically that's relating to my issue. One thing I do take away from this, however, is that it is either my power supply unit that is malfunctioning or my GPU that's the root of the cause. And a few months back, I started to notice that my monitors wouldn't always turn on when I booted my system. And unless I pressed the reset button, I wouldn't be able to get any input and wouldn't be able to use the computer. It would simply state that my monitors had no signal. Because that is often a symptom of a malfunctioning power supply unit, it was starting to indicate to me that it was probably the PSU that was the issue here. And it made sense that in that case it also wasn't able to deliver enough power to my GPU, which would then result in the throttling of my system and thus result in low FPS and so forth. Weirdly enough, I had ran some tests on my PSU and they all seem to come out fine, but then again, it doesn't always mean that it works. So since I'm in a bit of a time constraint, considering a new league had just begun and I'm supposed to be playing and releasing new videos and streaming, I decide to make the rash choice of ordering a new... I'm not sure what's happening up there. I decide to order a new power supply unit, and I'm gonna go pick it up myself so I don't have to wait for it to be delivered. This includes a 4-hour drive, but at least I'm able to plug it into my machine when I return. And any of you guys who have any experience with building your own PC knows that except for changing your motherboard, the PSU is probably the second most annoying thing to replace in your setup. You have to connect with all the new cables, remove the old ones, and move stuff around in your computer. And because I have a pretty large cooler, then there isn't that much space in my tower. So I have to, I pretty much take everything out and clean it and do the whole perfection OCD thing where everything gets polished and everything looks good and then replace it. And it takes a lot of time. But one thing I probably have neglected over the course of the years is actually cleaning my power supply unit properly, because that requires me to take it out of the tower and open it up, and that's a lot of extra work, right? So when I looked at my power supply unit after I'd taken it out, it was pretty much filled with dust and dirt, and obviously that's never good. One thing I did notice though, that there was a couple of things that looks like, I think maybe glue. It looked like it had melted and it was now covering some of the copper cables, and it doesn't look like it should do that, but then again, I'm not really sure. But to me, it was a further indicator that it could probably be the power supply unit that was in some way malfunctioning. So as I, and then something great happens. As I remove it and place the old power supply unit on my kitchen counter, my wife and baby comes by to check on the progress, and somehow Nova, my daughter, manages to hit the PSU so it falls to the ground and the case splits open. And obviously that's never good. It took a few hits. But that's not the best part, because as my wife then turns around to see what happened, she, in the best form of a coup de grace, accidentally spills a glass of juice into the now open and possibly broken power supply unit that's on the floor. So if it wasn't dead to begin with, it definitely is now, or at least my chance of ever returning the new power supply unit in case the old one was still working is gone. So I'm really hoping at this point in time that it is my power supply unit that's the issue, because, well, otherwise I'm stuck with the new one and I've just wasted money. Shit happens, right? Once I get everything up and running again, it's 3 in the morning, and for good measure I decide to reinstall Windows once again. And after it's done, I directly install the GPU driver and then jump into Path of Exile and World of Warcraft to check if the issues remain. And both games seems to be running perfectly at this time. Yes! Then it was the PSU. That's great, because I would much rather replace a PSU than a GPU. There's a big price difference, right? So far so good. So I head to bed thinking tomorrow I'm going to get all my programs set up, and I am pretty optimistic. But you guessed it. The next day, as I do some additional testing, I once again start to experience these issues, and it of course means that I bought a new power supply for naught, and I have no chance of returning it, as the old one is obviously destroyed by my dear beloved next of kin. So that was money well spent. And I keep running tests, and it's obvious there's still an issue with how the GPU utilizes power. Every time it hits 100% power, it throttles my system and it becomes unbearable. The weirdest thing about this, as I mentioned before, is that while it is normal for your GPU to hit that power limit and then start to throttle, in my case, it doesn't, or the throttle is way too powerful. It completely it goes from 144 FPS, which is what I've limited my system to, 8 FPS. That's way too aggressive. And another thing is that it doesn't return again. Like it's your GPU is supposed to throttle a little to prevent it from using too much power and increasing heat, but it's not supposed to do it in a way where it destroys your system like this. So knowing that it is pretty easy and harmless to try and increase your GPU's power utilization via afterburner, or precision for that matter, I decided I want to try and increase my power TDE, because if that works, it should mean that my GPU won't hit the power limit as often as it does now, and maybe the issue could be solved that way. Fortunately, I can open afterburner without my system crashing at this point in time. And in doing so, I can see my GPU is currently set to its standard 100% power TDE, and while there isn't anything to worry about in regards to increasing this power level, I start out cautiously, of course, and I increase the power slider up to 105%. As soon as I hit apply, my system instantly crashes. What the fuck? I try again with just 1% increase, same thing happens. I tried with various different percentages, same thing happens. Crash, 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 crash. And I need to make it clear that this is a standard procedure for any of these types of cards. Anyone can do this safely. There should be no reason that my system can't do this. So this is very, very confusing. Again, something that indicates some kind of issue with power that my GPU apparently doesn't seem to handle very well. So I tried with the other software too in precision, and the same issue happens. It's not just afterburner. So apparently I have no possible way of increasing my power output on my GPU, with one exception. Most of you are aware that you can update and flash your motherboard's BIOS rights, but what many might not know is that you can do the same thing for your GPU. A graphics card has a BIOS similarly to your motherboard, and by tweaking this you can adjust fan speed, clock rates, voltage limit, and power limit, things like that. So maybe that could be my solution. And this is where things get a bit weird. Before I'm going to attempt this, I of course need to check what my current GPU BIOS version is. And for that I use the software GPU-C. Through this I can tell that my BIOS version is 86.02.39.41.92. Alright, so good so far. I then type this into Google and I can see them leading to a 1080 Ti GTX 11GB, which is exactly what I have. But I do notice that something seems a bit off at first when I look at this card that it's redirecting me to. And I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I soon realized that this GPU that this BIOS is referencing isn't like my GPU. First of all, it has 3 fans, whereas mine only have 2. Another thing is that this card also has a slightly higher boost, memory and clock rate compared to mine. So apparently there's a mismatch between my GPU and the BIOS. And when I look further into it, the GPU that this BIOS belongs to is the FTW3 1080 Ti card. Mine is the black SC version. So this is the wrong BIOS for my GPU. Very weird. Very weird. Again, I haven't done anything with my BIOS or anything like that. I haven't even tried to overclock it at this point in time. This is how my GPU came. So I can see 3 possible reasons for this to happen. The first is that this 1080 Ti card that was sold to me as a new product in reality is a used and repackaged card that someone has returned to the retailer, and then they have simply sold it to me as a new card. The person who had it before me seemed to have been doing a few experiments on it, which to be fair isn't too far-fetched, as people who enjoy overclocking often swap the GPU BIOS for a faster version in the same product line. Take this card for instance. By swapping the original SC Black GPU to the FTW3 BIOS, the card's power output potential can instead of just reaching 300, go as far as to 358, which is a significant increase when power limit seems to be the main throttle for these types of cards. So maybe someone have had this card before and returned it, and then they've sold it to me as a new card without checking if the BIOS is working or if it's the right BIOS in the card. The second reason could be that the card have had a software misconfiguration when it was produced, but it seems unlikely. And the third option is, of course, that this is intentional in some way, and I just don't know the reason to this. So yeah. And also I need to emphasize that I'm not trying to cast blame on either the retailer that sold me this product nor EVGA, as I simply don't know who or if anyone is responsible for this oversight, if it is an oversight. One thing is for sure though, my card is supposed to have the SC Black version, not the FTW3, and that means that my card is currently set to settings that it's not supposed to have. So either way, to cut a long story shorter, I tried to reflash my GPU with the official BIOS directly downloaded from EVGA, but despite my attempt and a successful reflash, it doesn't change anything. And the question then is, if having had the wrong BIOS on my card for more than a half year, running at unintentional clock speeds could in some way have damaged the card. As a final attempt to see if there's anything I can do on my end, I removed the heat sinks from the card and apply new thermal paste, and that didn't change anything either. My fairy tale ends with me eventually just accepting that I'm unable to repair the GPU myself, and I'm gonna have to RMA it. So I hope they will repair my card, and then I plan on selling it once it returns, because in the meantime, since my job is doing YouTube and all that stuff, I simply can't wait 3 to 4 weeks for it to return to me. So I decided to buy a new graphics card. I now have a 2080 Asus ROG Strix, which is performing very, very well, by the way. And since I plugged that in and reinstalled Windows for what must be the fucking 10th time or something like that, my computer has been running flawlessly. So I don't know. This took a very, very long time to get to this point, and maybe if I just tried a new graphics card from the get-go, maybe that would have been the sole reason. But yeah, I'm inclined to believe that my GPU, because it's only 6 months old, the reason that it's failing is probably because it had the wrong bias to begin with. And of course, it's very frustrating when you buy such an expensive product for it to then possibly be a used product that someone else have been tweaking with and returned. And who knows why did that person return the card, right? Either way, I ended up spending money on new RAM, a new GPU, a new power supply unit, and I wasn't able to produce videos. And I'm completely behind on everything right now, trying to catch up in the new league. So I guess the reason I wanted to get this video out was just to tell you guys that I'm sorry for not having had any content for you. I know a lot of you guys are waiting for the Cobra Lash Assassin Belt guide and update, or the new build videos and such. And I feel even worse in regards to my Patreons, members, and Twitch subscribers, because you guys, after all, are paying and supporting the channel in that way. And I'm going to try to catch up. Hopefully, at least now you can see that it's not because I've just been lazy and been doing nothing. I've really been trying hard to figure out what the issue was. Either way, let me know in the comments below what you think could be the issue for this, what the reason could be, if you have any idea. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?